He conquered most of the known world before the age of 35. He rewrote the legal systems of nations. He broke empires that had existed for centuries. He moved armies across mountains in winter that every military expert said could not be crossed. And in the end, he died alone. On an island in the South Atlantic, 6,000 miles from Paris, talking to servants who couldn't understand him about battles that were already becoming mythology. Most people hear that ending and think, tragedy. I want to suggest something different. I want to suggest that Napoleon's ending was not a punishment delivered by fate or by his enemies. It was the logical conclusion of something that began long before the first battle, long before the first victory. It began with a feeling he spent his entire life trying to outrun. Ajaccio, Corsica, 1769. A small island, recently transferred from Genoa to France the year before Napoleon was born, which meant that Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who would embody France more than any figure in its history, was not legally French at the moment of his birth. His family was minor Corsican nobility, noble in classification, not in reality. They were educated enough to know what they lacked, connected enough to feel the distance from real power, poor enough that it mattered. He was sent to military school in France at 9 years old. 9. He spoke French with a Corsican accent that the other boys found funny. He had no money when they had allowances. He was small when French aristocratic culture quietly worshipped physical presence. The historical record is full of accounts of young Napoleon sitting alone, reading, studying maps, watching the other boys with an expression that witnesses described as difficult to interpret. Not sadness exactly, something colder. Something that looked like a person deciding that the world they had been placed in was simply wrong, and that they would correct it. Here is the psychological truth that Napoleon's biographers often soften. He was humiliated young, deeply, repeatedly, and he never forgot it. Not in the way that broken people carry humiliation as wounds. In the way that certain people convert humiliation into fuel. A fuel that burns clean and hot and does not extinguish, but that also, over time, burns the person carrying it. The French Revolution began when Napoleon was 20. For most people, revolution meant chaos, danger, the terror of the guillotine, the uncertainty of a world where everything that had been stable suddenly wasn't. For Napoleon, it was the opening of a door. Old France had a ceiling. If you were not born into the right family, the right name, the right network, you were contained. Revolution removed the ceiling. And Napoleon walked through before the dust had settled. The Siege of Toulon, 1793. He was 24. French Republican forces were attempting to retake the port from British and Royalist control. The campaign was failing. Napoleon, a junior artillery officer, drafted a plan that the senior commanders had not seen clearly. Position the artillery here, cut off the supply lines there, force the British fleet out of the harbor. Not by attacking the ships directly, but by making their position untenable. It worked. He was promoted to brigadier general at 24. What happened over the next decade is the kind of thing that makes military historians argue about genius versus circumstance versus the terrifying combination of both. Italy, Egypt, the 18th Brumaire, first consul, emperor. By 1804, Napoleon stood in Notre Dame Cathedral and took the crown from the Pope's hands and placed it on his own head. Because he would not allow even the most powerful religious authority in the Western world to be the one to grant him legitimacy. He would take it himself. This is the moment most stories treat as the peak, the coronation, the empire, the glory. But I want you to notice something that almost never gets attention. Napoleon, at his coronation, was not relaxed. Contemporary accounts describe him scanning the crowd, watching the faces of the marshals, looking for something. Reassurance, perhaps, confirmation.
The boy who had been laughed at for his accent was now Emperor of France, and he still could not stop watching to see who was laughing. I want to stop here and ask you something. Do you know someone like this? Maybe you've worked for someone like this. Maybe you've seen it in a founder, a CEO, a coach, a parent. The person who is never satisfied by the victory they just won because they are already afraid of losing the next one. The person whose hunger does not diminish with feeding, it intensifies. Psychology has a term for this pattern, several actually, but underneath the clinical language is something simpler. When a wound forms early enough, when the core belief becomes, I am not enough, I must prove it again, again, again. No amount of external validation repairs the internal damage. Because the internal damage was not caused by lack of achievement, it was caused by a child who needed something human, acceptance, belonging, safety, and received instead a world that told him to earn it. We are living in a civilization that has industrialized this wound, that has built entire economies around people who are convinced they are not yet enough. The productivity apps, the optimization culture, the biohacking, the constant metrics, all of it is a sophisticated answer to a question that was never really about productivity. The question is, am I enough? And the system's answer, always, in every form, is not yet. Try harder, do more, optimize further. Napoleon heard that voice too. He just heard it from inside. The Moscow Campaign, 1812. This is where it breaks. Not because Napoleon made a tactical error, he made many. The overextension, the underestimation of Russian logistics, the failure to account for winter. But these were symptoms. The disease was something else. By 1812, Napoleon had been at war almost continuously for 15 years. He had slept in tents, in palaces, on the ground before battles, in carriages moving through the night. He had watched hundreds of thousands of men die under orders he had given. He had built an empire that required constant expansion to justify its own existence, because an empire that stops moving starts revealing the cost of what it took to build. The men who had followed him, his marshals, his generals, had begun to change. They were rich now. They had estates, families, things to lose. And Napoleon, who had always read rooms with terrifying accuracy, could feel it. The same thing he had felt in the Senate long before men moved against him. The warmth going out of the room. He pushed harder. This is what people with this wound do when they feel the world slipping. They do not rest. They do not recalibrate. They accelerate. Russia, 600,000 men. Moscow burned before he arrived. The Russians retreated, scorched the earth, refused to give him the decisive battle his entire system was designed to win. And Napoleon sat in the Kremlin for 34 days, waiting for the Tsar to negotiate. The Tsar never came. And Napoleon, who had built his entire psychology on the premise that will could overcome reality, discovered that sometimes reality does not negotiate. The retreat from Moscow killed more men than any battle he had ever fought. Frostbite, starvation, Cossack raids, exhaustion. Of the 600,000 who entered Russia, fewer than 100,000 came back. And Napoleon rode ahead of them, back to Paris, to raise another army. Because the alternative, stopping, facing what had happened, acknowledging the cost, was not something his psychology was built for. He raised another army, lost at Leipzig, abdicated, was exiled to Elba, escaped, raised another army, lost at Waterloo. The pattern is almost mechanical in its repetition, because it was. St. Helena, a volcanic island, 1,200 square miles, population a few thousand, 6,000 miles from Europe. Napoleon lived there for 6 years. He dictated his memoirs. He rewrote history, or rather, he wrote the version he needed to be true.
He blamed his marshals. He blamed the weather. He blamed the British. He blamed circumstance. And in his private moments, in the accounts of those who lived with him, something else appeared. Regret. Not for the wars, not for the men who died, for something smaller, more personal. His son, Napoleon II, the King of Rome, had been taken to Vienna after the first abdication. Napoleon never saw him again. There are accounts of Napoleon on St. Helena asking about the boy, what he looked like, whether he was healthy, whether he remembered him. The man who had remade Europe, who had placed his siblings on the thrones of Spain, Naples, Westphalia, could not reach his own child. He died in 1821, 51 years old. The official cause, stomach cancer, possibly arsenic poisoning. Historians still argue. His last reported words, according to multiple witnesses, were spoken in delirium. He was back on the battlefield, issuing orders, directing troops that existed only in a mind that could not stop fighting, even in death. There is a version of Napoleon's story that ends with a lesson. Work smarter. Know your limits. Don't overextend. I don't believe that version, because the thing that destroyed Napoleon was not a strategic error. It was the same thing that built him. The wound. The 9-year-old boy sitting alone in a French military school with a foreign accent and a cold, clear decision. I will never be powerless again. That decision conquered Europe. That same decision could not allow him to stop, could not allow him to rest, could not allow him to sit in a room without calculating who was a threat, could not allow him to simply be with his son. The most powerful men in history are rarely free. They are driven, and there is a difference. A free man chooses where he goes. A driven man has no choice at all.